January 27th, 1944, Halesworth Airfield, England. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group sat in the cockpit of his P-47 Thunderbolt, writing a letter home. His hands still trembled from yesterday's combat mission over Germany. The cold metal of the pen felt foreign against his numb fingers as he struggled to find words that wouldn't terrify his wife Barbara back in Lawton, Oklahoma. He wrote about how the German pilots in their Messerschmitt 109s seemed to appear from nowhere, how their machines climbed faster, turned tighter, how they slashed through American formations with a confidence that bordered on contempt. "Barbara, I'm scared," he wrote. "They told me our P-47 is tough but slow, that we can't catch them in a climb, that we can't turn with them, that our only hope is to take the punishment and pray the armor holds. Every man in my squadron feels like we're flying into a fight with one hand tied behind our backs." But less than 6 months later, this same Robert Johnson would become the second highest scoring American ace in Europe with 28 confirmed victories. And nearly every one of those kills would be a Messerschmitt 109, the very aircraft he feared so deeply that winter morning. So, what happened between that cold January day and the end of the war? Who really won this battle for the skies over Europe? Was it the sleek, nimble Messerschmitt that German engineers had perfected over years of combat? Or was it the massive 7-ton American fighter that seemed better suited to hauling freight than dogfighting? The answer isn't what you might think, and the story of how American pilots figured it out is one of the most remarkable transformations in the history of air warfare. When the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt first arrived in England in early 1943, German pilots had already been flying the Messerschmitt 109 in combat for nearly 4 years. They had refined their tactics over the skies of Poland, France, Britain, and Russia. They knew every strength and weakness of their aircraft. They had developed techniques that had destroyed thousands of enemy fighters, and when they first encountered the Thunderbolt, many of them laughed. Captain Franz Stiegler, a Luftwaffe pilot who would survive the war with 28 victories of his own, later recalled his first encounter with the American fighters over the North Sea. "We called them the Jugs," he said in a 1989 interview. Short for Juggernaut. "We meant it as a joke. They were so big, so heavy. We thought, how can the Americans be so foolish, sending these fat pigs against our 109s? It will be a slaughter." The German pilots had good reason for confidence. The Messerschmitt U-109, particularly the Gustav model that dominated production by 1943, was the result of continuous evolution since 1935. It weighed just under 7,000 pounds fully loaded. The P-47 weighed over 13,000 pounds. The 109 could climb at nearly 4,000 feet per minute. The early model Thunderbolts managed barely 2,000. In a turning fight, the lighter German fighter could complete a full circle in roughly 22 seconds. The P-47 needed closer to 28. On paper, it looked like a massacre waiting to happen. Captain Walter Beckham, who flew with the 353rd Fighter Group out of Metfield, remembered his first briefing about the Thunderbolt with a mixture of disbelief and dark humor. The intelligence officer stood up there with his pointer and his charts, telling us about this airplane we were about to fly into combat. He recalled in his memoirs published in 1991, he told us it was the biggest single-engine fighter ever built, that it had 850 caliber machine guns, that it could take tremendous punishment, and all I could think was, That's what you tell someone when you're sending them to their death. You tell them about the armor and the guns because you know they're going to need every bit of it. You don't tell them they can outfly the enemy because everyone in that room knew we couldn't. The early combat reports seemed to confirm everyone's worst fears. In April 1943, during one of the first major escort missions to Germany, the 4th Fighter Group lost 4 P-47s to Messerschmitt 109s without scoring a single victory in return. Lieutenant Dwayne Beeson, who would later become an ace, wrote in his diary that night about watching his wingman, a kid from Wisconsin named Tommy Hall, try to turn with a 109 over the Zuider Z. Tommy pulled as hard as he could, Beeson wrote. I could see his aircraft straining, the wings flexing under the G-forces, but the German just kept turning inside him, tighter and tighter until he had a perfect deflection shot. Tommy's P-47 came apart in the air. 1 second he was there, fighting for his life. The next, just pieces of aluminum tumbling into the sea, and the German pilot just wagged his wings and climbed away like he was swatting flies. The loss rate was staggering. In May 1943, the 56th Fighter Group lost 11 aircraft in combat. In June, 14 more. The men started calling their bases in England waiting rooms because they knew most of them wouldn't survive long enough to see the end of the war. But something else was happening in those early months, something that the statistics and the loss reports didn't capture. A few pilots, a handful of men who combined stubbornness with careful observation were beginning to notice something odd. The Messerschmitt 109 wasn't invincible. It had weaknesses, and the P-47, for all its bulk and weight, had strength that nobody had yet learned to exploit. Hub Zemke, the commander of the 56th Fighter Group, was one of the first to see it. Zemke was a farm kid from Montana who had learned to fly in the Army Air Corps and had spent years thinking about fighter tactics. He was analytical, methodical, the kind of officer who read every combat report and debriefed every pilot personally. And in June of 1943, he started noticing a pattern. When his pilots tried to dogfight with the Messerschmitts, turning and twisting at low altitude, they died. But when they fought from above, when they used the P-47's weight to dive at tremendous speed, they survived, and sometimes they even won. Zemke began conducting experiments. He would take his pilots up to 30,000 feet, higher than most bombers flew, and practice high-speed diving attacks. He discovered that the P-47 could exceed 500 miles per hour in a dive, faster than any Messerschmitt could safely go. He found that at those speeds, the Thunderbolt's controls stayed responsive, while the 109s would stiffen and become almost immovable. He realized that the same weight that made the P-47 hopeless in a turning fight gave it an enormous advantage in vertical maneuvers. The airplane wasn't designed to dogfight, he told his squadron commanders in a meeting that Lieutenant Gerald Johnson recorded in his diary. It's designed to be a killing machine from altitude. We dive, we shoot, we climb away. We never, ever turn with them at their altitude. Never. But changing tactics required changing mindsets, and that was harder than learning any maneuver. These young American pilots, most of them barely 20 years old, had grown up watching movies about the aces of World War I, reading stories about Rickenbacker and Luke and their swirling dogfights over France. They had trained to dogfight. Their instructors back in the States had taught them how to turn and bank and scissor. The idea of refusing combat, of diving away from an enemy, when every instinct screamed at you to turn and fight, felt like cowardice. It felt un-American. Second Lieutenant Robert Johnson, the same man who had written that fearful letter in January, was one of the first to truly embrace Zemke's tactics. On June 26, 1943, Johnson was flying escort for B-17 bombers, returning from a raid on Paris when he spotted a formation of Messerschmitt 109s positioning themselves for an attack from below. Instead of diving down to meet them at their altitude, Johnson climbed. He took his flight of 4 P-47s up another 5,000 feet, positioning himself directly above the German fighters. Then he rolled over and dove, building speed until his airspeed indicator showed well over 400 miles per hour. The Messerschmitts never saw him coming. Johnson fired a burst into the leader from directly astern, walked his tracers through the cockpit, and flashed past so fast that the German's wingman didn't even have time to react. Johnson pulled out of his dive 2,000 feet below, used his momentum to zoom back up to altitude, and was setting up for another attack before the remaining Germans even realized what had happened. Johnson described the experience in a letter to his wife that night, and his words capture the moment when everything changed for the American pilots. "Barbara, for the first time since I got here, I didn't feel helpless," he wrote. "I wasn't trying to fight their fight. I was fighting my fight, using my airplane the way it was meant to be used. That 109 pilot never had a chance because I never gave him the chance to turn with me. I hit him from where he couldn't hit back, and I was gone before his friends could react. This airplane, this big, heavy, ugly airplane might just be exactly what we need. We just needed to figure out how to use it." The German pilots noticed the change almost immediately. Franz Stiegler, the Luftwaffe ace, later remembered a mission in August of 1943 when the dynamics suddenly shifted. "We were attacking a bomber formation near Schweinfurt," he recalled. "We expected the P-47s to come down to our altitude and dogfight like they always did. Instead, they stayed high, and then they came down like thunderbolts." He used the German word blitz, like lightning. "One pass at incredible speed, and then they were gone, climbing back up before we could react. We tried to follow them up, but they were faster in the climb than we expected, and by the time we got to their altitude, they had repositioned and were diving on us again. It was like fighting ghosts. We couldn't pin them down." The statistics tell the story of the transformation. In July 1943, the 56th Fighter Group claimed 12 confirmed victories against 6 losses. In August, 23 victories against 4 losses. By September, the ratio had improved to nearly 4-1 in favor of the Thunderbolts. The airplane hadn't changed. The Messerschmitt 109 hadn't gotten worse, but the American pilots had learned to fight a different kind of air war, one that played to their strengths instead of their enemies. But there was another factor, one that took longer to manifest, but ultimately proved even more decisive. The P-47 Thunderbolt was tough in ways that defied belief. It could absorb punishment that would tear any other fighter to pieces and still bring its pilot home. And as the months wore on and the combat intensified, that durability became as important as any tactical advantage. Robert Johnson himself provided the most dramatic example on June 26, 1944, exactly 1 year after his first successful diving attack. Johnson was escorting bombers over Germany when a Focke-Wulf 190 caught him by surprise, damaging his aircraft before he could react. Then a Messerschmitt 109 joined the attack. Johnson tried to dive away, but his controls were damaged. For the next several minutes, the German pilot systematically shot Johnson's P-47 to pieces, hitting it with more than 200 rounds of 20mm cannon fire and machine gun bullets. The rudder was shot away, The elevators were shredded. The cockpit canopy was shattered. Bullets passed within inches of Johnson's head. He was covered in hydraulic fluid and oil, and yet the airplane kept flying. Johnson nursed that shot-up Thunderbolt across 200 miles of German territory and the English Channel, landed it at his base, and walked away with minor cuts. When the ground crew examined the aircraft, they counted more than 200 separate hits. The crew chief, a sergeant from Detroit named Joe Egan, later told a reporter that he had never seen anything like it. Any other airplane would have disintegrated, Egan said. A Spitfire, a Mustang, a 109, any of them would have been scrap metal after the first dozen hits. But the Thunderbolt was built like a tank. It had a radial engine that could keep running with half its cylinders shot out. It had armor plating around the cockpit. It had redundant systems. It was designed to be hit and keep flying. And that's exactly what it did. Word of Johnson's survival spread through every P-47 squadron in England within days. The effect on pilot morale was profound. These young men, who had spent months feeling vulnerable and outmatched, suddenly realized they were flying an airplane that could protect them even when tactics and skill weren't enough. They started taking risks they wouldn't have dared before, pressing attacks longer, staying in combat when they might have disengaged. They knew that even if they got hit, even if they made a mistake, the Thunderbolt might just get them home anyway. Lieutenant Walker Mahurin, who would finish the war as the fourth-ranking American ace in Europe with 20 confirmed victories, described the psychological shift in a post-war interview. "It wasn't that we stopped being scared," he said. "You're always scared in combat. But we stopped being terrified? There's a difference. Terror makes you hesitate, makes you defensive. Fear without terror makes you sharp, makes you aggressive. Once we knew the airplane could take a beating, once we knew we could make mistakes and still survive, we fought differently. We became hunters instead of prey. The learning curve wasn't just about tactics and durability. It was also about understanding the limitations of the enemy. The Messerschmitt 109, for all its advantages in maneuverability and climb rate, had weaknesses that became more apparent as American pilots gained experience. The 109's fuel capacity was limited, giving it barely 90 minutes of combat time before it had to return to base. The P-47, with its massive fuel tanks and external drop tanks, could stay over Germany for hours, escorting bombers deep into enemy territory and engaging German fighters at will. The 109's narrow landing gear made takeoffs and landings treacherous, and German training accidents killed hundreds of pilots who never saw combat. The 109's cramped cockpit and limited visibility made it vulnerable to attacks from certain angles, blind spots that the Americans learned to exploit ruthlessly. Major Gerald Johnson, who commanded the 63rd Fighter Squadron, became particularly adept at exploiting the 109's weaknesses. Johnson had studied every intelligence report on the Messerschmitt, had interviewed every pilot who had fought against it, had even examined captured examples to understand its design. He discovered that the 109's canopy structure created a blind spot directly behind and below the aircraft. German pilots knew this and tried to compensate by constantly checking their 6 o'clock position, but in the chaos of combat, maintaining perfect situational awareness was impossible. Johnson taught his pilots to position themselves in that blind spot, just a few hundred feet behind and below their target, and wait for the perfect moment to strike. Between August 1943 and April 1944, Johnson personally shot down 16 Messerschmitt 109s, and he later estimated that at least 10 of those kills came from attacks the German pilot never saw coming. The Germans tried to adapt They introduced the Messerschmitt 109 Gustav VI model with improved armor and heavier guns. They changed their tactics, trying to avoid the high-altitude diving attacks that the P-47s had perfected. They assigned their most experienced pilots to intercept the American escorts before they could reach the bomber formations. But they were fighting a losing battle against not just tactics and technology, but also against numbers and resources. By early 1944, American factories were producing hundreds of P-47s every month. German production, hampered by Allied bombing and resource shortages, could barely replace combat losses. Every experienced Luftwaffe pilot who died was nearly irreplaceable. Every American pilot who was shot down was replaced by two more, often with better training than their predecessors. Captain Heinz Baer, a German ace with more than 200 victories on the Eastern and Western fronts, described the growing sense of futility in his diary. In March of 1944, we shoot down 10 of them and 20 more appear the next day, he wrote. They have learned to use their heavy fighters well, staying high, diving fast, refusing to fight our fight, and even when we hit them, even when we pour cannon fire into them, they often survive and limp home. We know now that we cannot win this battle through skill alone. There are simply too many of them, and they have become too good. The climax of the P-47 versus Messerschmitt 109 rivalry came during Big Week in February 1944, when the 8th Air Force launched a massive campaign to destroy German aircraft production facilities. Over 6 days, American bombers struck targets deep in Germany, escorted by hundreds of P-47 Thunderbolts, flying missions that would have been impossible just 6 months earlier. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had into the defense, and the skies over Germany became a massive arena where American and German fighters clashed in battles involving hundreds of aircraft. At a time, the Americans lost 33 P-47s during Big Week. The Germans lost more than 300 fighters destroyed and nearly 100 pilots killed, including some of their most experienced aces. The kill ratio had shifted so dramatically that the Luftwaffe High Command began withdrawing day fighter units from the Western Front, conceding air superiority to the Americans rather than watching their remaining pilots be slaughtered. Hub Zemke, the 56th Fighter Group commander who had pioneered the diving attack tactics, led his pilots through some of the fiercest fighting of Big Week. On February 21, 1944, Zemke's group engaged a formation of more than 40 Messerschmitt 109s near Brunswick. The battle lasted nearly 30 minutes, a chaotic, swirling furball at altitudes ranging from 15,000 to 30,000 feet. The Americans used their tactics perfectly, maintaining altitude advantage, diving to attack, climbing back to safety. When the smoke cleared, the 56th had claimed 17 confirmed victories, including Zemke's own 13th kill against 2 losses. After landing, Zemke gathered his pilots for a debriefing, and his words, recorded by the group intelligence officer, captured the fundamental shift that had occurred. "Gentlemen," he said, "6 months ago we were afraid of the 109. Today the 109 is afraid of us. That's not because we're braver or because our airplanes suddenly got better. It's because we learned to fight our fight, not their fight. We learned to use every advantage we have and to deny them every advantage they have. That's what winning looks like. It's not about having the best airplane. It's about understanding your airplane and using it perfectly." The question of who won the battle between the P-47 Thunderbolt and the Messerschmitt 109 can be answered with statistics, but numbers only tell part of the story. By the end of the war, American P-47 pilots had been credited with more than 3,500 air-to-air victories in the European theater alone. The Thunderbolt had the best kill-to-loss ratio of any American fighter, better than even the famous P-51 Mustang. Robert Johnson finished the war with 28 confirmed victories, 24 of them Messerschmitt 109s. Hub Zemke had 19 confirmed kills. Walker Mahurin had 20. Dozens of other pilots achieved ace status, 5 or more victories, flying the aircraft they had once feared was obsolete before it ever saw combat. But the real answer to who won isn't found in the statistics. It's found in the transformation of those young American pilots from terrified novices into confident, skilled hunters. It's found in their willingness to throw away everything they thought they knew about air combat and learn an entirely new way to fight. It's found in the stubborn determination of engineers who built an airplane that could absorb incredible punishment and still fly. It's found in the words of German pilots who went from mocking the jug to respecting and fearing it. In 1989, Franz Stiegler and Robert Johnson met for the first time since the war at a reunion of American and German fighter pilots. The two men, now in their 70s, spent hours talking about their experiences. Stiegler told Johnson about that day in August 1943 when he first realized the Americans had learned to fight differently, when the easy victories had suddenly become desperate struggles for survival. Johnson told Stiegler about that January morning in 1944 when he sat in his cockpit writing a letter home, terrified of the Messerschmitt 109 and convinced he wouldn't survive the war. They laughed about it, the way old warriors laugh about fears that once seemed overwhelming but were eventually overcome. At one point during their conversation, Stiegler asked Johnson what he thought made the difference, why the P-47 pilots eventually dominated when the Messerschmitt 109 seemed so clearly superior in the beginning. Johnson thought for a long moment before answering. We learned that air combat isn't about which airplane can turn the tightest circle or climb the fastest, he said. It's about understanding your strengths, understanding your enemy's weaknesses, and having the discipline to fight your fight no matter what your instincts tell you. The 109 was a great airplane, maybe even a better airplane in some ways, but we were flying the right airplane. For the war, we were fighting. And once we figured that out, once we learned to use it properly, nothing could stop us. That's the real answer to who won the battle for the skies. It wasn't the machine. It was the men who flew it and their willingness to transform themselves from students into masters of a new kind of warfare. The P-47 Thunderbolt didn't defeat the Messerschmitt 109 because it was superior in every measurable way. It won because the pilots who flew it learned to make it superior in the ways that mattered. They learned that survival isn't about matching your enemy's strength for strength. It's about understanding yourself and your tools well enough to create advantages where none seem to exist. That's a lesson that transcends aircraft design and aerial tactics. It's a lesson about adaptability, about learning, about refusing to accept that the game is rigged against you just because someone else wrote the rules. The young men who flew those Thunderbolts into the skies over Europe learned that lesson the hard way, paid for it with the lives of friends and brothers, and ultimately proved that determination and intelligence can overcome even the longest odds.